Welcome to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, a window into the soul of the North Fork of Long Island. We'll delve into the pulse of our community, its pressing issues, promising opportunities, and the rich stories that weave our shared history. I'm your host, Christopher Bianchi, and for episode 108, we sit down with Richard Olsen-Harbich, the Director of Winemaking at Bedell Cellars. We'll explore his journey from his early interest in winemaking to his time in college, his experiences working on the South Fork, and his eventual move to the North Fork, where he's been shaping the region's wine identity. Join us as we discuss his passion for the craft, the evolution of Long Island's wine scene, and what goes into making great wine at Bedell Cellars. So I hope you enjoy episode 108 with Richard Olsen-Harbich. This episode was recorded January 15th, 2025. Thank you so much for coming on to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast today. I'm really looking forward to talking to you today.
Thank you, Christopher. Thank you for inviting me. And I look forward to having a discussion about North Fork wine.
Thank you. So just in the beginning, I'd like to ask if you could just give a little introduction about yourself, and where you were born and raised.
Sure. And I have a lot of that in my book too. I think it's important for that. But I was not born into a famous winemaking family or in a famous wine region, but I grew up in New Hyde Park, New York. To German immigrants, and graduated high school there, and always had a real desire for the natural world, to be outdoors, to see things grow. And that's where that passion took me to Cornell. So I was a plant science major there, graduated, went to Stony Brook a few years later to get my master's in science education. I've been working as a winemaker and a wine grower on the North Fork and the South Fork of Long Island for more than 40 years. And love the North Fork for all of its natural beauty and really unique character in this part of the world. So thank you for having me on.
Definitely. So growing up in suburban Long Island, what sparked your dream of becoming a farmer, especially in an area not traditionally known for winemaking?
Yeah, I get asked that question quite a bit. And my answer has evolved over time because it's not just Long Island that, or where I grew up, that produces winemakers and wine growers in this country. I mean, there's very few people my age, and I'm going to be 64, that grew up, that were born to a winemaking family, West Coast, California, or here. It just, there's very few. There were some, especially in California, and some in New York. Well, it wasn't very common, way less common in the EU, where you have a long history of wine production. So, yeah, the interesting part, I think it was something that just occurred inside of me. I mean, I wasn't in charge of it. I was always drawn to the outside. My father loved the outdoors. He was an immigrant. Interestingly enough, he was actually born in New York City and then grew up in Czechoslovakia, but he didn't speak any English because he was only about 3 when he went back. My mom was born in Germany. That really didn't come into play with regard to wine. My family wasn't a big wine drinking family. My father liked his beer. We had some on occasion, mostly German wine. It was very special holidays and things like that. It was really, I think, my entry into the world of wine didn't come from exposure to lots of wine and a family that was had wine aficionados and
Mm-hmm.
wine lovers involved. It came more from the agricultural side, from the growing of the vines,
Mm-hmm.
the plant itself, how it worked, how it grew in certain conditions. That was always my focus. I had a huge bug collection when I was a kid. I was into entomology. I was into biology, microbiology. And so that's where the spark was there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the other kind of genetic connections kicked in later when I realized that my mom was born in a house that was basically surrounded by vineyards in the Rhineland. My grandparents worked in vineyards when they were younger, back in the early 1900s. My grandfather on my father's side ran a speakeasy selling illegal alcohol in Lower Manhattan for the entire decade of the 20s.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's that connection as well. But I didn't find out about that until much later.
And coming out of high school, and did you know you wanted to, or exactly what career you were thinking of, or even majoring in at Cornell?
No, not exactly. It's funny because I started out as a botany major, mm-hmm. and was really kind of intrigued by animal husbandry and raising animals, and I started with a few courses in dairy science. Worked in a milking parlor with cows, and I grew to love cows. I think they're just beautiful animals, but it wasn't, I don't think, a life that I would have been happy with. And I don't like getting up at 4 a.m. That was a big non-starter for me. Mm-hmm. Plus, it wasn't a career. It had to be a love, even more so than winemaking. Because it's such a difficult living. Mm-hmm. So really, it wasn't until my junior year, and we were actually, my wife and I, who I met at Cornell, and just married 40 years now, we met and fell in love over a bottle of Herman Weimer Riesling from the Finger Lakes. And at that point, I was kind of more focused on apple growing pomology. That was the major that was available at Cornell in 1981. And so I had a lot of focus on tree, fruit, orchard management, things like that. But there was some classes on grape growing, viticulture, and winemaking. And something just clicked inside of me, and I thought, like, this is, I think, a very cool thing to do. And I think part of me agreed on some level that, I don't know, there was just something that felt right about it. It had the agricultural aspects, which I was so interested in it, but it also had this element of romance, and it had science, and it had just the culinary aspects, the olfactory aspects, and it had prestige in agriculture, really. Wine growing is, one of the most precious types of horticulture, of growing a plant on a larger commercial level. It's the upper echelon in terms of farming. So I thought it all looked pretty cool to me. And it has the historical aspect behind it too. There's so much history wrapped up around wine, not just in the stuff that we typically read, but in the terms of production and the techniques used. They are attached to stories that go back hundreds of years. So that was it for me.
Yes.
I was hooked. And I'm really glad.
Yes.
I was. And still am.
And could you talk a little bit about what drew you back to Long Island after Cornell?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I wasn't necessarily thinking I was going to wind back on Long Island.
Yeah.
That wasn't exactly in the plan.
Yeah.
And it was funny because, part of me really loved and still loves the Finger Lakes where Cornell is. And that was really, what I was thinking of possibly, or even somewhere else, maybe West Coast, maybe overseas. And I was like, yeah, I tell people I got into this, also because I imagined that I would be working in an exotic, far off place.
Mm-hmm.
And now I'm in Cutchogue,
Mm-hmm.
Long Island, maybe an hour and a half from where I was born. Something was meant to be, I think. So before I was graduating, I went to the Cornell job office on campus, and I was like, I didn't have a job. I was graduating. I was going to go to Europe with my parents for a little trip, and I really didn't have anything else going on. And I saw this advertisement for a job to run a vineyard in Bridgehampton, Long Island. And they were looking for somebody, ASAP. So I met with the owner of this, contacted this gentleman named Lyle Greenfield. I don't know if I wrote him a letter or called him, couldn't do anything else. And then I went out to see him at a house in Bridgehampton, and it was amazing. I'd never been there before. Beautiful, the sunlight. The actual vineyard was a ruin because it was not taken care of properly. But Lyle and I became very great friends. I worked for him for 10 years, starting the second winery to open on Long Island called the Bridgehampton Winery, which no longer is in business. But yeah, that was my first foray, and I was hired to take care of the vineyard, and about 6 months later was asked to take on wine production because the fellow they had lined up didn't work out. So this was like a week before harvest. So I was like, okay, sure, I'm game. He's like, well, I'm going to get you somebody to help you. You're going to work with Herman Weimer from the Finger Lakes, who I was aware of. I loved his wine. So I was like, okay, this is great. So I was able to start off with some great help and great advice. And Lyle gave me that opportunity, and I ran with it. And all the background that I had and the studies that I had made. And I continued to learn for 40 more years about what the best way to make wine in this part of the world is.
Mm-hmm. And even initially coming to the South Fork, had you ever visited the North Fork at all before that? Or
before that, I hadn't been really east of Riverhead for 18 years. Honestly, we always went the other direction. And there was, the Hamptons wasn't my parents' scene. And the North Fork really was not talked about at all as having any sense of destination. It was mostly where the potatoes were grown. There were very few restaurants, very few farm stands even. That wasn't even as big a thing as it is now because there was no traffic to support them. So it was a little bit of an unknown. I got to know it very well because when I was at Bridgehampton, it was a smaller vineyard and it had a lot of problems. Sometimes we'd have fruit, sometimes we didn't. Sometimes the entire vineyard would be killed to the ground by winter temperatures. So I was basically on the North Fork a lot, visiting the growers that were at that time happening here. And so as soon as we started, you had companies like Bedell and Lenz, Pindar. Of course, the Hargraves were already here. And so it was just starting to explode. And so there were a lot of vines going into the ground with the anticipation of, making wine or selling the grapes. And so there was a lot of grapes to be purchased. So I spent a lot of time on the North Fork and worked a lot, mainly with North Fork grapes for the most part, because that's where the great vineyards were. Our vineyard turned out to be mainly a disaster, and really brought the company an inability to be sustainable. So, but no one knew at the time. Lyle didn't know. Those things were a hard lesson learned, and he was one of the pioneers that took a huge arrow, but to find us out. So now we know Can't just because it's down here on Long Island, you just can't plant grapes anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
They're not always going to succeed.
And what year was that you initially came to the South Fork?
Well, I had actually the South Fork. I had actually started. I skipped a part because I started working in vineyards with David and his son Stephen Mudd in Southold, and that was, I think, 1982. So I did that entire growing season and then went back to class. So that was really the first vintage that I worked on. So, and with my first exposure to the North Fork and being hands-on. But yeah, after a 10-year stint with Bridgehampton, I moved to the North Fork and have been here ever since, working for a number of different companies. Bedell being my longest tenure now, going on 15, 16 years. So,
and you mentioned some of the challenges on the South Fork with that winery and kind of going through some trial and errors. Were there any other challenges that you faced within the region, and also with the region still finding its identity as a wine producing area?
Oh yeah, I mean this isn't a, I've seen it in real time, like how a wine region starts and evolves, and that's kind of cool because it happens a lot faster now than it used to. I mean, in the old days, it might take 500 years to really get a name for yourself. Bordeaux started in the 1100s growing vines. The wine was not thought of as highly as it is today. It was a commodity. It took a couple hundred years. We have a lot of information now. We know what works and what doesn't work. And so, we saw issues with the types of plant material we were getting, the plants that we could buy, basically Chardonnay, Merlot, or Cabernet Sauvignon, whichever. They weren't always the best that were sent to the East Coast. And we didn't really know those exact types of varieties that would grow best here. As I say, there was no textbook for growing and making wine on Long Island. So it took a number of different plantings, different varieties. The one thing that's consistent, though, and the reason that we became so successful is that we have the climate to grow European grape varieties. And in the context of the historical East Coast, no one had really done that before because it's too cold or it's too hot in the South. Virginia was starting to do it just around the same time as we were. Excuse me. Up until then, all the European grape-produced wines were on the West Coast, and the eastern regions were mostly dependent on American grape varieties. Same genus, different species, produced entirely different wines. It's Concord grape juice, Welch's grape juice. We'll put in a plug. But those flavors, they're a little bit over the top. They're very American. They're loud. They can rub people the wrong way. Not subtle, but they can be really delicious and sweet and good. But the wider wine market didn't really agree, and they were hard to sell to people, easier to grow. And so upstate New York never, at that point, wasn't putting their toe in the water for that kind of production with European vines. They were highly, fallible. Whereas down here, we're not getting so cold in the winter. We don't have these limiting temperatures where the vines start to be killed. The buds in the vines start to die, basically below zero. Even for 5 minutes, it can damage the vine. It's very numerical, and we've proved that was really the issue here, and what has made us famous. And those varieties are what drive us still. In particular, the red European varietals that have shown to be very good to grow here and have a real affinity for our conditions. We're near the ocean, we're humid, we have great sun, we have wind constantly breezing, drying off the foliage. It's a real confluence of events. And being where we are, I guess it's somewhat surprising being 2 hours east of New York City that this wasn't figured out earlier. But, we've never been for a couple hundred years, we weren't a wine country. We weren't wine centric. We were beer, whiskey, bourbon centric, going back. So this is an evolution. And now maybe we're going in another direction. I don't know. But, there's a whole other movement towards non-alcoholic lifestyles. So things change. Wine industry doesn't change very quickly. So it's very traditional. I kind of like it that way. I like the classics in general. And I think winemaking as a form of agriculture is one of the most classical of all.
Yes. And also, could you share kind of the story of authoring the 3 AVAs for the region and how these applications reflect the unique terrain of the Long Island?
Sure, yeah. I mean, this was initially, I go over this in the book as well because it was an interesting experience. The whole process. We were, Lyle Greenfield and I were going to a meeting of just a handful of the people that were growing grapes and making wine. It was just the beginning of an organization at that point. It was called the Long Island Grape Growers Association. That was an organization that was, nascent at the time. And the point of the meeting was, do we want to have a Long Island designation or a North Fork designation? And these designations are American viticultural areas that are regulated by the feds. They started them in the 70s. And we were one of the earlier ones, actually, since we've been approved in 84, 85, and 86. There's been a lot of them. But the point of it was to designate both through, geopolitically, but also through climatology, soils, weather, temperatures. And you have to show that whatever area you want to have applied or, being used on the label has distinct differences from the neighboring land right next to it. So, some of it's limited by weather stations at that time. Now we can get weather pinpoints from anywhere all the time. But then it was going to the library and taking masses of books and getting all the information, talking to people one-on-one, weather takers. There was a gentleman in Bridgehampton, Richard Hendrickson, who at that time was already almost 80, and he had been taking weather since their early 30s, every single day, right down the street. So the Hamptons came out first. I had great data. And then North Fork Growers, which at that point, we were the only company in the Hamptons, Long Island. All the other acreage, all the other growers were on the North Fork. They had tried to get an application through, kept getting kicked back. I don't think anyone really wanted to do the work. So they were like, hey, can you do this for us too? And I was like, sure. I mean, I was at various points one of the vice president or president of the Long Island Grape Growers Association by that point. And so I made the application for the North Fork. I already had the data because I had to show that for the first application that the Hamptons was different from the North Fork. And it was different from everything else west of Riverhead, essentially. So I had all of that. I just turned it upside down. And the case could be made easily. There was some other work that had to be done, historical work. Alan Kinney from Pindar at that time helped me with that. we put the application through, and it was approved. Years later, I did an overall Long Island AVA, just because it's the easiest, most direct way to protect Long Island as a name on a bottle of wine.
Mm-hmm.
Because an AVA requires that 85% of the fruit in that wine be grown on Long Island.
Mm-hmm.
And there was rumors, and I had rumblings, and I know because I'm in the circles of what some people were thinking of doing.
Mm-hmm.
And, we wanted to keep this region legitimate and as pure as possible. So ultimately, that's why I did it.
Mm-hmm.
And it gave people another name to use on a label. If we're selling it out of state, Long Island, New York was recognizable. So it was a win-win.
Yes. And do you think also early on in the development of the region, getting people to come out to the area, whether for wine tasting events or also getting the wine, because I've asked a few other people about having the wine reach a broader audience, whether in New York City, and getting more people to try the wines out here, because the people might have expected to just say, oh, well, I'll take a California or a Washington state wine instead of a Long Island.
There's still a lot of those people.
Yes.
They're all over the place. But yeah, I think we've come a long way. The idea that people could go and drive out east and stop at a winery and taste what actually was going on, and it was at that point they didn't have to pay for it. Wineries were offering free tastings. Most of them were. And that was something to try to convince people that they should try what they were doing. Yeah, I think some of the early wines were, not the best. I made a lot of them. A lot of it had to do with our understanding of viticulture and how we were growing the grapes at that time versus how we do it now. We know we've learned a lot more about how to produce fruit that's going to taste the best in that wine. It's not just like growing grapes to eat, or there's it gets very detailed and rigorous in terms of the amount of labor that has to go into that. So
yes. And then also, what inspired you to pioneer the use of wild yeast in winemaking on the East Coast, and how has this approach influenced the North Fork's wine identity?
Well, yeah. Excuse me. I didn't pioneer the use of it. It's been here forever, and there was, quite a few. In fact, probably most wineries pre-World War II were making wine that way.
Okay.
It's very simple, and it works. And in previous generations, most of the wine made in the world up until the last probably 100 years, let's say, has been made with wild yeast. It only became, commercial yeast became more involved because actually it's a business. And part of their business was kind of selling insurance, selling a guarantee, some comfort for winemakers. Same as, this is the same concept as making bread. Most bread has been made through a method similar to sourdough, where the yeast that we have in the air everywhere are free, and you could just capture them and grow them. That's how most bread has been made. So it's nothing new.
Okay.
It did become kind of taboo to use wild yeast. When I first entered the industry, it had fallen out of favor. It was thought of as unreliable and, would not complete the job that we wanted it to do. It was lazy. They denigrated wild yeast. And I think it was driven by the commercial yeast companies that were looking to sell yeast that you could get for free. It's everywhere. So that's my little conspiracy theory. I have no idea if it's true, but I think it's probably somewhat true that is in play. And academics kind of poo-pooed wild yeast. I did it because I wanted to, at some point, I had used commercial yeast for a long time. It's easy. And I was trying to see, okay, this one says it's great for Sauvignon Blanc. Great catalog, great words. I want to make a great Sauvignon Blanc. I'm going to get that. And I did that for years. And it got to the point where I was getting bored. And I was like, people were wondering what Long Island was. What is it supposed to taste like? What is its identity? People were talking about the identity of wines from everywhere else in extreme detail, and where they were growing and how the terroir was affecting these wines. Just rapturously going on about these different wines. And I thought, we need to figure out what our wine is. This can be talked about in the same way. Why isn't anyone talking about it in this way? We make wines that can be right there with some of the best in the world. I'm confident in that, but no one's talking about it. And when people are asked, what does that taste like? What do wines from Long Island taste like? No one could answer it. And so one of the ways I thought I'd try to find the answers, because I love to find answers to problems. That's kind of what drives me in a lot of things. But I was trying to see I'm definitely not going to get the local character from a commercial yeast that was designed in South Africa or Australia or New Zealand or in California. I'm not going to get, what am I getting from that? Why don't I just use what I have? Let's just use the yeast that are growing here, that is on the grapes. It's in the air. It's on the leaves. It's on the stems. It's in the tank. And that's what we started to do. That's what I started to do. And it worked beautifully. The wines kind of shifted character into just a more softer and more elegant approach. And they really, that's what's supposed to happen. So these are the wines that I make at Bedell and have made. The winemaker now has taken over from me is Marin Brennan, who worked with me for now 15 years, is carrying on this technique and putting her own spin on it. But we have to do it like a sourdough starter, just like when you're baking bread. If you wake up in the morning and you say, okay, I want to make bread, and you don't have any yeast, you can't really do anything. It's going to take time. We do the same for white wines, mainly because we are now utilizing cooler fermentation temperatures, so that the yeast don't like cold temperatures. They get shocked. And so I start a culture with wild yeast beforehand, usually a week or so. And years ago, I started a ceremonial thing where people would bring in leaves and elements of the North Fork natural world, whether it's seashells or rocks or fruits from trees or flowers, grasses. And that all goes into the culture as well, with the thinking that I want to try to get other forms of yeast that may not be prevalent in just this kind of monoculture vineyard. So we went into the hedgerows, people's backyards, etc. And what we wind up with is a beautifully aromatic starter culture that is then used for every white wine and the rosés. The reds, by the time we get to the reds, we leave them out in the vineyard hanging on the vine so long to get so ripe that they're just like a horse at the barn door waiting to get out with terms of fermentation. So we don't need the starter culture anymore at that point. But again, it's all the same yeast that we've allowed to grow. If we did it over and over, it would be the same. And the reds have a similar yeast on them already that's dominant from the vineyard.
So in terms of Long Island sustainable wine growing, what are some of the most important sustainable practices you've championed, and how do they shape the future of the region, possibly?
Well, I think the whole concept of sustainability and sustainable agriculture is important. Obviously, we worked on this project since 2012 when it started. And, for people who are listening, sustainability is basically to attempt and be conscious of the fact and mindful of the fact that we don't want to foul our own nest in general terms. We know that we can't not leave an impact because that's just what every creature does. But to try at least minimize the impact, or at least the worst aspects of it. And I think most people, what made it easier for Long Island growers is that it's a small region. We're just hitting about 3,000 acres, which is tiny in the grander scheme of things. So already people were working closely. They are working more attached to the land, closer to the vines, and we're closer to our neighbors than in some other parts of the world where vineyards are out in the middle of nowhere. So we have to be conscious of that. The aspects, I think, that make sustainability, to me, not only the most scientifically valid, eco-friendly program, but also the only one that attempts to deal with human issues, human beings, and how they are treated and how we are working with them, giving them things that they need and require, days off when you're sick, access to healthcare, a living wage, etc. None of the other eco programs even touch that. And so that's important to me. And I'll be the first to say we haven't done enough in that regard. But and we need to do more. But that really rounds the program out. At the same time, it's also has to make business sense in terms of what we can or can't do to be more environmentally friendly. That's getting more challenging. But realistically, it's a challenge. And I think sustainability recognizes that. And that's why it's fluid. That's why it can respond to new information, new research, new ideas. Whereas the other eco certification programs, namely the organic program and the biodynamic program, are completely dogmatic and will never change. And it makes it difficult to actually do them. So there's a lot to discuss there. I go into it in the book a lot because it is a topic that is very familiar with people, yet I think not well understood.
Yes.
So,
but then also you've mentioned some of the stuff we've covered, you've talked about in your book, which the book's called Sun, Sea, Soil, Winemaking on the North Fork of Long Island. But could you talk about how the idea for your book came about?
Sure. Well, I would say the original title that I wanted was Sun, Sea, Soil, Vine, with a subtitle, A Terroiriste Manifesto. So a terroiriste is somebody who was a play on words. My publisher didn't like it at all. They were like, this is a problem. We can't put this out there.
Yeah.
I said, okay. So in the reprint special edition deluxe version that comes out someday, I'm going to that'll be the new cover. But yeah, so I had been writing. I like to put down thoughts, as you can tell. And so I was doing blogs for a couple of different websites, a couple of different magazines. Edible East End was one, but we also had our own in-house blog. And I really felt that at that time, this story of this region, what's going on, what we're doing, what we're thinking, needs to be told. And I didn't feel like it was being told. I didn't feel like anyone was talking about us. And we're all really busy. But that's what drove me. So I had pieces of the book from here and there already, done when I went into it. And I was actually writing another book before this one that is basically a historical fiction, had nothing to do with wine. And that was more family history. And I kind of hit a wall with that. And then I just thought, I have this book in me that I just need to get out. It's going to be easy because it's just like pouring out of me all the time. And I've got these pieces I've already done over the years about topics that I still wanted to discuss. And I kind of reworked those. Some of them needed to be updated, especially things on like climate change and techniques and different things that are different now than a few years ago. So I had the pieces. I had a publisher who offered, I sent out to a few different university press, Cornell, SUNY Press. I got a good friend of mine, Carlo DeVito, who put in a good word for me at SUNY Press. Within a couple of days, I had a contract. I was like, this is cool. You know, I want to be a paperback writer. You know, I love that too. So that's what happened. Had a great team, great editor. It was a wonderful process from start to finish. Absolutely. Richard Carlin was a gentleman at SUNY who brought me in, and yeah, it was a nice experience.
Wonderful.
I didn't really do it, except I just felt like I had it in me and I wanted to get it out there because I want people to understand this really special place that we live in. And it's really, and I've traveled all over the place, and this place is just super special. And I'm not even talking about the wine. And when you put the wine into the equation, I mean, there's just beautiful things that are being created, beautiful wines that are being created but by so many different producers here. And it's something we need to treasure and preserve and hold on to because it's so unique in this part of the world. It doesn't happen in a lot of places. The microclimate is literally a microclimate. And I hope that it's with us for a long time. We need to take care of it. And one of the things the wine industry has done is help preserve farmland. It helped replace some of the larger methods of agriculture that were failing at the time and under direct threat from purchasing by developers and development companies. So that's one of the other positive aspects of the wine industry. Excuse me. And it has grown from there. It has grown into a place that has, fantastic restaurants, fantastic experiences, a real, breweries, wonderful neighborhood shops, wonderful neighborhood places to buy food. None of it was at the level it is now, even 30 years ago. It's changed dramatically, for the most part, for the better, although we have to be careful to not let it, go off the rails. It has to be done very deliberately and with a good plan.
Yes.
Not an easy task these days, but so far so good. The wine industry has been the main reason for the success of the farmland preservation program that's taken place. We have 9,000 or so in the North Fork AVA, 9,000 acres or 20,000. I'm not sure. Someone can correct me, but I thought it was close to 10,000 of preserved farmland. Not all of it is arable necessarily, but preserved land.
No, that's really important. And some people might take it for granted just driving by and seeing the open space, but not realizing that this area easily could have been developed in the past 30 years if it wasn't for a lot of these wineries or the wine region becoming a successful place. I
think development, it's the overriding most important issue in terms of the future of this area and this agriculture in general, because there's only so much density this area can withstand before there's a serious negative aftershock. We don't have a sewer system. There's no, I don't know if Greenport does, but maybe Greenport Village. I'm not sure.
I should know that.
No, it's okay. But there's no the North Fork doesn't have a sewer system. We have mainly backyards with cesspools and cesspool systems. Mm-hmm. Where's that going? Mm-hmm. We also have only one water table that is not that deep. What are we doing? Mm-hmm. There's only so much the region can take. Mm-hmm. There has to be a good plan in place. Mm-hmm. And, if development is going to continue, which it will, it always does, there needs to be a plan and monies for proper cesspool, sewer mm-hmm. water treatment. Mm-hmm. I'm sounding like I'm running for like town board. Sorry, but no. It's an environmental issue that I'm acutely aware of, and it's a big part of sustainability. A lot of the information and a lot of the practices that were put together were codified with the water table in mind and water resources in mind. Mm-hmm. What materials go into the water table the fastest? Mm-hmm. How fast do they move through the soil? These were all factors we took into account. And a lot of those things are not allowed. Mm-hmm. How much nitrogen are we allowed to put down?
In terms of the runoff?
Yeah. Nitrate in underground water mm-hmm. supplies and in the surrounding waters is an issue. That and the warmer temperatures, you've got like fertilizer to a house plant. It's just going to start to grow that much faster, mm-hmm. and you've got different things happening on the sea bottom than used to. Mm-hmm. I'm going off the rails, but it's important. Development is important, and I know the town has done a pretty good job at this so far. Mm-hmm. But it has to be careful.
Yeah. Also, so I had a question also about your collaboration with Bordeaux legend M. Paul Pontellier of Chateau Margaux, which is quite historic. How did this partnership come about, and what impact did it have on Long Island wines?
Sure. It was a very important development when we started to look at and work with our partners in Bordeaux. When we first started to get into the regional aspects of where we were growing and what we were planting, and seeing what worked and what didn't work, those were the first vineyards planted out here. Were kind of just a casserole of different varieties. We did have a research plot in Riverhead at the time. It was early in the 80s, but it was a replicated plot throughout New York State. A lot of it was Native American varieties that we really weren't interested in growing here. The goal, again, was to grow classic European varieties, which were in high demand, made the best and most expensive wines in the world, were thought of as the best wines in the world. Classic examples. Mm-hmm. Things like Sauvignon Blanc and Pinot Noir and Cabernet Sauvignon and Riesling. The greatest hits, if you will, of European winemaking. So we were trying them all. A lot of them didn't work very well. Kip Bedell at Bedell is famous for planting Zinfandel, a little bit of it, and just was a complete failure because it's just too humid and we have too much rain at various times for that kind of grape, and it's very winter tender. It may be fine for a few years, but at some point the vine will be pretty much killed back to the ground 1 year and have to be regenerated, if you're lucky. It's not a good business plan. So, again, successful wineries in the most historic places, Bordeaux, Burgundy, the Rhineland, Spain, all the famous wine regions in Portugal, they are sustainably successful and have made the great wines that they make because they're growing the grapes that they found best suited for those specific conditions. Those are the grapes that like to be there. They thrive and flourish there, and they make ripe and beautiful amounts of fruit, and the wine is delicious consistently. And so that's what we needed to find out, because that's what defines a great wine region. We were lucky in that we can do lots of things really well. And that's kind of where we wound up. But early on, in terms of the famous red European varieties, and there's lots of them, there's Sangiovese and Chianti, Nebbiolo, the famous grapes of Bordeaux, Pinot, etc. The ones that were most successful here in the vineyard, in the wines that were made into them, were the Bordeaux reds. So it's Merlot, Malbec, Cab Franc, Cab Sauvignon, etc., and Petit Verdot. And so we saw this connection in the vineyard first. We did some further digging. Larry Perrine, who was a researcher at Cornell at the time, did a climate and precipitation study, showed that there were similarities between Bordeaux and our region, more so than anything out west, more so than anything in California.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a growing consensus that, okay, this is probably the reason why we're seeing these varieties really have an affinity here, and the wines are tasting good from them. Pinot Noir, we tried to do that one. That's, that works once in a while. Some of the others didn't work at all. Many of the others, it's too humid here, too much rain, too cold. Lots of reasons. It's a Goldilocks place for these particular grapes. And so we took that and went forward with that, and it led to putting a conference together where we invited some of the best names in Bordeaux winemaking and viticultural research. And so we had a number of people come over in 1988, Paul Pontoyer included, who was then managing director at Chateau Margaux. So we had met at that point. The conference was a huge success. It really changed our thinking on how we're growing our vines. We can pinpoint that spot of that conference in 1988 to a different style of winemaking post-conference versus pre. A lot more attention to detail, a lot more exposure of the fruit to the sun, a more focus on tighter planting, more closer spacing of vines, more focus on the end game of growing grapes, which is what it tastes like in the bottle, which is a disconnect, if you could imagine, in the industry very often. It's a complete disconnect in terms of the folks and the people and the philosophy involved in the farming aspect of grape growing versus the production of the wine. And here we have more of a traditional European approach where we've meshed those two components of wine production. And that's what Paul, really helped us look at and figure out. And he was a student of terroir as well. And when we went to him to work with us, Steve Mudd and I contacted him to work with us on the Raphael project. He basically jumped at the opportunity because he was so curious about what this grape Merlot would taste like here versus what he's looking at there. He was a natural, very inquisitive guy. So we collaborated for 9 years, and I learned a great deal from him about the relationship between the vineyard and the cellar, the growing of the grapes, and the spirit and the kind of mindfulness that goes into its transformation into wine, and to trust the process and trust what we are working with in the field. We know it's successful. Once you have that, you need to trust that it will be a successful wine. So it was a lot of foundational philosophy about winemaking that I was very grateful to receive from him. And he agreed that these conditions are, similar. It doesn't mean we're the same, but every winery in the country is pretty much growing things that have been historically somewhere else. So that's the modern wine world.
Yeah.
And so we are now, I think, part of a greater East Coast developing production wine-focused market and region that is going to give the American consumer, it's going to grow in importance. the West Coast has a number of issues. Some of them we could see in the last week, which are problematic, and lack of water, fires, overproduction, too much competition, too much heat, not enough water. And we have ample rainfall. We have coastal cool conditions, and we can make a style of wine that is more similar to what the old world has been doing. In fact, we're probably making wines like the old world did 50 to 100 years ago, because they're getting warmer as well. So we are actually a throwback. At some point, we're going to become a throwback style of wine production that no longer exists anywhere else except there. Maybe that'll be the next book. I don't know.
But, I mean, especially in New York, I think that was mentioned that Cutchogue was the sunniest place within the state of New York.
Yes.
But even with climate change and everything, I think the North Fork, we're still in a positive state in terms of how it's benefiting us compared to other regions, like you said, California. But even in the past, like you said, we've been one of the sunniest places and a good area for the future right now for growing even more traditional based wines.
Yeah, you mean for climate change?
Yes.
Yeah, we have a lot of resilience for sure with regard to climate change. We have these surrounding waters which act as a huge buffer, just a massive amount of water. When you really look at the map and look at how deep that ocean gets, there's a tremendous amount of buffering of our climate that takes place around us because of that. More so than New York, because we have literally the full force of the Atlantic coming at us at various times, or circling down from like northern Canada straight down. So, yeah, it's very unique. It's very different. We've been able to see a longer growing season, slightly more sunny days, higher temperatures in the fall. It's interesting because I think it seems like spring is pushed a little bit forward. Like it seems like it's cooler, longer, and nicer later in the year. So, for example, the average date of the first frost in the fall, first time it gets to 32 degrees, is typically like the end of October, has been like October 26th, October 30th. We didn't have a frost until Thanksgiving this year. And even then, I'm not sure it was actually a hard frost.
Yeah. Yes.
It was late.
Very late.
Not that you could grow anything, but, I still had like impatiens in pots on my back deck. We still had leaves on the vines for weeks into November. So it's interesting. And in the meantime, we had a frost in early May, which took a big, we took a big hit for that. A lot of companies, a lot of vineyards did in terms of losing crop for the 24 vintage. So, we'll see what happens. I mean, ultimately, the wine quality has gotten better. The season has gotten longer. We can let the grapes ripen longer. We can look at, I think now, varieties like Cabernet Sauvignon to do next level quality wines. And again, probably a retro Bordeaux wine circa 1920 style of Cabernet that is no longer possible in Bordeaux, and is certainly not possible in Napa. So, yeah, it's a work in progress. Net benefit right now, I think the long-term outlook is not as optimistic. We do have significant water problems. We're going to be depleting more. We're going to get more rain, but maybe not keep up. And we've got massive storms that could hit us. It helps us to be out in the middle of the ocean, but it's also a little risky.
Yes.
But that's what makes it fun. It's a little danger involved in the wine, in growing things out on a piece of land sticking 100 miles out into the Atlantic Ocean.
Yes. But also, just looking at working out in the wine industry for decades, in terms of lessons that you might have learned, what ideas or things would you pass on to the next generation of winemakers out here or even just in general?
Well, I think it's important. I would tell them to read the book, number one. Because a lot of what I would say, that's one of the reasons I think I wrote the book, is to pass along just my thoughts and what I've learned is important, and I think could be important to the next people coming, and there's still a lot more to figure out. But I think it's, growing. I think it's the same in any profession, but especially these kind of professions where there's both a collaboration of art and skill, art, craft, and knowledge, basically scientifically verified knowledge. It takes a special person. You have to love it. I think if you love it, in this case, they always say, like, hey, if you love what you do, you should do that. You'll, be rewarded. But I think it's true in this. It's a rewarding thing to do. I certainly have loved it. And I would say, in terms of the North Fork, I would just be authentic. Trust the process, trust the grapes that are making this journey in this strange place. That you're going to make something really special and delicious.
Yes. And I know we touched on some possible trends for the future of the region, but do you feel are there aspects of the region's history or identity you feel are still untapped or unappreciated in the broader wine world?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I remember that one. Yeah, I think I went into it in the beginning of the book because I thought it was underappreciated in the fact that for the United States, the first place where anyone talked about making wine or even investigating the possibility of a commercial wine industry being a valid thing to do in this part of the world was Verrazano, the explorer, in early 1500s, mid 1500s. It's the first time anyone's ever talked about making wine in what is now the United States, because he was sailing around the western end of Long Island, and at that time there was tremendous amounts of grapevines growing off the shores of what's now Brooklyn, and so many that Verrazano was writing about it and acknowledging the fact that, because he took very good notes, he took a very good journal of his travels. So there's information about that, how this could be considered. It reminded him of vineyards at home and maybe the possibility of a wine industry. As this is the people who were paying for his ship and his trip wanted some information in return. If they want to come back here, what's here for investment? And so there was always information like that brought back in terms of from wine, because of what all the wild vines that they saw. So they naturally thought, well, then we could grow any kind of grape here. It was also like 100 years later, the Dutch started to see this and they started to comment on it. Nothing ever happened with the Italian government or the information that Verrazano sent back. Dutch explorers came, said the same thing. And it was a Dutch block who was sailing around Long Island and mapping it, named Block Island after, and commented the same. Another Dutch explorer, Adrian van der Donck, I believe, mapped and wrote about the possibility of a wine export business from the colony to provide Holland with the ability to drink wine and have imported wine. They were at war with Spain constantly. They ran out of wine all the time. The ships were blockaded from France. They didn't have any wine. They were looking for an outlet to then make their own and avoid all of these, blockades and wars and shortages. So none of that struck home. I guess those things abated. They realized they could buy it cheaper. And other things like fur and tobacco and sugar and slavery. Unfortunately, these became the big dollar signs that everybody started to go after. So you had exploitation of natives for furs and, the horror of slavery involved in this. They didn't pay attention to wine. They should have. It would have been better for everybody.
Yes.
So, yeah, I don't think most people understand that. We're not that new to the game. There's been grapes grown here for hundreds of years. Not successfully all the time, not commercially, but for a little while, yeah. It's really since the 70s and the Hargraves putting their flag down here that really kicked it off. So,
and now do you feel like it's with how much mature the grapes are now? It's a more mature wine region or established in terms of since some of them have been planted since the 70s or 80s.
Yeah, I mean, and a lot of that stuff is not here anymore. And a lot of those vines weren't great to begin with.
Or they weren't.
Yeah, we've learned that a Riesling vine is not just a Riesling vine. There's various clonal selections available that differ dramatically from each other in terms of its wine quality, in terms of its growing ability, growing characteristics. So the first stuff that went in the ground, the first plant material, was not the best. A lot of the clones were not available from Europe at that time, talking late 70s, early 80s. And the clones that were available were California selections that they were happy with, which means they had huge berries and they were tightly packed on the cluster because they don't have any rain. And a lot of those didn't work so well here. Same variety, different clones. And it's amazing the difference you can see in the just the clusters, the way the grapes are shaped, versus other clones where they could be half the size and the cluster is just straggly with lots of space around the berries. But the grapes, both make Chardonnay wine, and there's similarities in the taste. But so there's that much variation, and we have the ability now to make those decisions with a lot more information, a lot more success, and better wine.
Now, just looking back in terms of from a small suburban house near New York City to becoming a leader in sustainable winemaking and on the North Fork, how do you reflect on your journey from then to now so far?
Yeah, it's kind of funny, but I'm happy. And I feel very proud of what I've been able to accomplish and the life that my wife and I put together and our family, our children. Feel a lot of success at this stage of my life. And at this point, in terms of both my children and the wine business, it's, they need to continue to figure it out on their own and continue to grow. And so I'm hoping that happens. I know it'll happen with my kids. I know they're good. I hope it happens with the wine industry that has been built here and started. I think the wines themselves will just continue to get better. I have no question about that. I think with dedicated, passionate, creative people, both in the vineyard and in the cellar, I think there's going to be amazing wines coming from here and will continue to garner higher and higher levels of praise, quite sure. And so that makes me proud. So, yeah, I still love what I do. I'm pulling back somewhat, but I'm still in it. Maybe another book, who knows?
Yes. And then also, if you could craft a perfect wine that encapsulates your career and the North Fork, what what it tastes like?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the wines that do that for me are the ones that we sell as Musée. It's our top red wine that we can make in any given vintage. Typically, it's got the best barrels of that particular season. The wines that were made from there, just red wines, whether they're Merlot or Petit Verdot or Cab Franc, they just have a certain beautiful, delicious quality to them. And this is all a very sensory thing. The way I describe it is, I don't know if you're a musician at all, but
I play the drums.
Okay, yeah, I'm a drummer too. But it's like when you're tuning a guitar string,
yeah,
or a piano for that matter. If you're playing a note and there's a certain point where it's just in tune, and that's how I describe a taste of a wine that just it's in tune. All the constituents, like you might taste a lot of wines that are slightly flat, out of tune, but they're good enough. It's a nice melody. It's just a little, it's a little out of tune. And sometimes that can work, but other times they're just this completeness, sense of completeness to the wine. And when that happens, we'll make Musée. It doesn't happen every year. The North Fork is a type of place where, kind of like the old world used to be, we just have some really good years, and we're going to have some years that are average, and we're going to have the occasional clunker. But you can't have, the reason we're here and successful and will continue to be is those clunkers getting fewer and farther between. And the better vintages are starting to stack up. And so that's a good sign. And the rainfall rates may increase a little bit, but they're going to be here, and we're not going to run out of water. And so it looks like a balanced system there. So the Musée, for me, is a wine where we put all those pieces together. We try to get all those pieces in tune with each other. And then it sounds really good. It's not just one string anymore. It's 6, 5. And yeah, that's part of the overall sensory. It's not math anymore. This is just a feel. And that's what we spend a lot of time at Bedell. And I'm not sure everybody does that. They should. But we try to get that level of that we're looking for, and then get it in the bottle. Because once it's in the bottle, you can't change it. Yeah, it's been recorded. That's your take. So, yeah.
Yes.
And I think that shows the North Fork at its best. It shows that, we can grow these European varieties, but lots of people grow European varieties on the East Coast now. A lot of white varieties are everywhere. You can find Chardonnay in Ohio. You can find Chardonnay in New Jersey or Maryland or Pennsylvania, all over the place. But you can't find wines made from Bordeaux varietals, the old Bordeaux grapes, everywhere. Not very often at all. And so we can do that here. That's our sweet spot. I think that's our summit that we try to climb every year. And the other ones are also great. Not putting them at any lower, but it's a difficult thing to do on the East Coast, and I think that we show the ability to produce these high levels of red wines that have a completely different feel to them than anything from the West Coast. They're lighter, they have lower alcohol, they have a little more edginess to them, a little more life. They're not something like if it's 85, 90 outside in the summer and someone hands you a glass of California Cabernet that's 16% alcohol and is so thick, and it's not refreshing at all. Yes. It has, whereas our reds can be refreshing, even even in periods like that, it goes with everything. Our reds can be served with fish easily. In fact, it's an old Bordeaux pairing to serve red wine with white codfish. So
yes,
yeah, I keep going back, but that's our kind of a spiritual home in many ways in terms of the wines that we make.
Definitely. No, and then I usually just ask at the end if there was anything else you wanted to say or discuss that we hadn't talked about or missed.
I don't know. I think we've covered a lot.
I covered a lot.
I think so. I think if anyone's interested in all of this kind of thing and the things that I've been saying, to check out the book.
Yeah, definitely check out.
Come down to Floyd Memorial Library. They've got a couple copies.
Yes, we got a couple of copies you can check out. But I want to thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast today and share your story and your passion for winemaking. It was really a pleasure to talk to you today.
It's a pleasure being here and talking with you as well. Thank you, Christopher.
Thank you. Well, I hope you enjoyed episode 108 with Richard Olsen-Harbich. I want to thank you for listening to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, and we'll see you next time.